Hey, good evening, everyone. My name is Jer Swigart, and I'm the co-founding director of the Global Immersion Project. And Global Immersion's work is to connect people of faith to the pain in the world in restorative ways. And we do that in a whole bunch of different ways. But tonight we're doing it through a webinar. And a webinar for us is an opportunity to really connect some of the most pressing questions of the everyday peacemaking movement with some of the thought and practical leaders in the world, and women and men who can help us think very practically about these super pressing questions, not just so that we get smarter, but so that we can be mobilized into the work of restoration on the planet. So we're excited that you're here with us, and this is going to be an incredible conversation. This particular webinar is framed around the question: has my theology and political preference impacted my ability to see? And in full disclosure, we went back and forth a bunch of times on the title of this webinar, wondering if we shouldn't name it, "How has my theology and political preference impacted my ability to see?" Because it seems as though it has for all of us. The divided world that we live in right now, I think many of us are waking up to just how potently theology and politics have shaped our perspectives, maybe even blinding us from seeing whom and how God sees. I want to just share a quick story that helps illustrate that. I was speaking at an event in the Pacific Northwest this summer, and at the end of the talk, I was sitting off toward the right, and I had just gotten done talking about a restorative theology and what it means to actually follow Jesus in this political milieu that we find ourselves in. And that there's a chronology. Following Jesus and citizen of the United States of America are both true, and there's a chronology to them that's important to pay attention to. And so it was a bit of a provocative conversation, and so I'm standing in the wings at the end, and this gentleman approaches me, and he whispers to me, "Hey, I've got an idea, and it sounds kind of crazy." Which is always a really intimidating thing once you've just gotten off a stage from speaking. And I said, "Well, what's up?" And he said, "While you were speaking around a restorative theology, things began to settle into place for me, the likes of which never had before." He said, I'm actually a U.S. veteran. I've got 4 military tours under my belt, and I've recognized that I've found a way to really connect my theology to my politics and my militarism in a way that's made a lot of sense to me. But something's going on in the room right now for me where I'm beginning to wonder about how that all took place and how it is actually informed the way that I show up on the planet. And he's a pastor now, and so he said, "Here's what I want to do. I'm wondering if I can go out on the stage and tell people the story of what's beginning to happen for me, because I think that I'm beginning to see more clearly. And what I want to invite people in the room to do is, if they are having a similar experience, I want them to come up to me so that I can pray over them. And then I want to send them across the stage to you so that you can pray for them as well, as they're having this epiphany or a sight healing is taking place for them." And I'm like, he's like, "Does that sound crazy?" I'm like, "Yeah, I think it sounds crazy, but I'm up for that." So he and I go out on the stage, and he's on the right side and I'm on the left side. And he's talking about how in that very moment, the Spirit was awakening him to a restorative theology that shows up in a restorative way in the world. And he's inviting people to consider how that might be happening for them as well. And if they're experiencing that at all, to come up and go through this experience. Hundreds of people stood up. And so we were expecting like maybe a few dozen would have that experience, but hundreds of people stood up and declared with their physical bodies, "I am having an awakening, that I have been limited in my theological perspective. I have paid allegiance to a particular political preference, and I think it's actually impacted the way that I've seen, and I'm ready for freedom. I'm ready for the healing of sight." And so we spent the next couple of hours just literally praying over people, which really solidified for me and for my team that there is an awakening happening. We're aware of how theology and politics have shaped our sight, and we're trying to figure out what it is that we can do about it. So that's the point of this conversation. How do we acknowledge it, and what do we do about it? Before we get into our panelists and my good friends Jenny and Tess, I want to just orient you all to the space. And for some of you, this might be your first webinar with Global Immersion. If you look at the very bottom panel of the Zoom screen, there's a chat feature there, and we want to invite you to open up the chat feature and just throw your name in there and where you're from, and maybe a word or a couple of words that really articulate why you're spending this evening with us. That'd be really helpful for Jenny and Tess and I to know that. So your name, where are you calling in from, and why are you on this call with us? The second thing is that you're going to see a Q&A feature, and that's the space where we really love for you to launch questions at us throughout the next hour. And so please be voraciously curious, and no question is the wrong question. It's all the stuff that's going to help shape this particular conversation. So we're wondering what you're wondering. So please utilize that Q&A feature, and we'll be paying attention to it throughout the evening, and getting you in touch with hopefully some answers, or at least some interactions to your questions. The third thing is we want to invite you to, at some point throughout the evening, just take a screenshot of what's going on here and capture a compelling thought or a practice that's really resonating with you out of what Tess and Jenny are about to share with us. In so doing, it gives you an opportunity to be really clear about what it is that Jesus might be doing right now as you're interacting with this information, but it also will help you name your desire or your intention to embark upon a journey toward a clearer sight. So all of that said, we're excited to jump into this particular conversation, understanding that we live in a political milieu that seems inundated with polarities and binaries, and it seems like theologically and politically, many of us are more interested in being right than being in relationship, and all it's doing is continuing to widen the divides between us. There's another way. There's a cross-shaped way for us to engage in this world that is humble and that is curious, that it breaks down walls and barriers, and it's a way of seeing more clearly. And so I've had to acknowledge personally that my vision is not 2020, that I have a very limited perspective, and that for far too long I've convinced myself that my narrow perspective is 2020 vision. And so there are things that I've had to do to break outside of that, to recognize there are things bigger and better and far beyond what I thought I knew. And Jenny and Tess are going to help us with that this evening. So that said, I'm going to let these two introduce themselves. They're both dear friends of mine. They and their families have been in my home. And so these people to me are not just thought leaders who are doing some cool things in the world. They're dear friends who take this particular conversation really seriously in their own lives and in their vocations. And so Tess, why don't you introduce yourself, and then we'll pass it off to you, Jenny, and then we'll dive in.
Great. Hi, good night. I'm in Texas. It's about 7 o'clock here. And when I found out what time it was, I got really excited because I have 3 kids, and I told my husband, you're in charge of dinner and bed and baths. And so I'm off work technically right now. So happy to be here tonight. Thank you for joining in and listening. And I love seeing the comments here. This is just an exciting thing for me to get to be a part of and share a little bit about my journey to seeing things more clearly with you all. My husband and I started a nonprofit called Seek the Peace 10 years ago. We've been working and immersing ourselves in the refugee community here in Dallas, Texas. Before that, we lived in China as missionaries with really kind of the goal to share the gospel and love Chinese people and get to know them and share meals. And we got to do a lot of those things. And when we came home, we were like, we're really bored. And we missed this international community that we had created there. And so we found out that there were all of these refugees 2 miles from where we were living. And we just kind of jumped right in. We moved into the community and have been kind of putting roots there for 10 years through different relationships and programs, and and then kind of releasing people that are in our lives and that we're getting to walk with into the community as well, to just love people where they're at. So that's been such a great joy in my life. And then I also help run a national advocacy platform called We Welcome Refugees. And really our mission and our goal is to mobilize the church to become advocates for refugees and immigrants, to understand the issues that are going on, to understand what bills are coming down the pipeline, what's on the ballot, how our theology has informed us to welcome the stranger and the foreigner, and to really engage in that conversation. We want to equip people to be able to do that really more fully by giving them language and tools around that. So that's me.
Awesome. Thanks, Tess. Why don't you jump in, Jenny?
Sure. So my name is Jenny Yang. I'm calling in from Baltimore, Maryland. And I actually I'm coming off of maternity leave. I had a baby about 3 months ago. His name is Joel, and he's adorable and cute and chubby and all of that good stuff. And it's been amazing actually being away, just taking care of a child for 3 months, when before that, in my position at World Relief, I've been providing advocacy and public policy oversight and leadership for the organization for almost 10 years now. And a part of that responsibility has really been kind of monitoring the day-to-day activities of the government and what elected officials are saying or not saying. But I would admit that just being on maternity leave for 3 months and unplugging from the day-to-day social media storms and reacting to every post and tweet has really provided me with a certain perspective of of understanding that God's doing something bigger in terms of us, his mission in the world, and that even for us as an organization, not responding to every little thing, but just being committed to just the daily things that he's called us to, I think is give me an interesting perspective just in the 3 months that I've been away. But yeah, I've been with World Relief for almost 15 years now. I started actually at the organization doing just casework for managing refugees that were being resettled to the U.S., as we're an organization that resettles refugees. And in that time, I've really come to understand just the role that public policy and advocacy play, and the role that politics can play in our Christian witness. Because I think before entering the organization, I had this mentality of the work that I was doing, just doing case management, was really, service oriented. And then it wasn't until I realized just the narrative around immigrants and refugees in this country and how that I felt like was detrimental to a Christian witness, made me really passionate about policy and about politics, and helped me to really engage in systems and structures in a way that I really hadn't done before. And so that's really transformed my understanding and my theology, I think, over the many years, just being at World Relief, but also my local community in Baltimore City. I've obviously been in a community that has welcomed refugees and entered into relationships with them, and just the process of learning from them and understanding their challenges and experiences and having that inform my theology has also been really impactful for me as well. So yeah, so it's great to be back and be plugged in. I look forward to just this conversation this evening.
That's amazing. So good. And so many congrats on the birth of Joel. What a great deal. We at Global Immersion just have a commitment to relationship, and in these moments, hearing from what we see to be some of the best. And you two are just that in so many ways. To our audience, Jenny and Tess have the opportunity to speak and think on panels and write papers and all this kind of stuff. The true invitation and a real gift for us tonight is that I've invited them outside of all of their talking points and pre-planned ideas, and to actually crawl inside of their lives and their stories. I'm even seeing in the chat thread right now, there's so many of us wondering about how do we really have conversations with people who differ from me politically? How do we really have conversations who differ theologically? I think that we'll interact with those tonight, because I think those are really driving questions. I think the bigger question is, how do we follow Jesus? Jesus engaged and stood diametrically opposed to any and every system that did not reflect the kingship of God. And Jesus wasn't partisan. Jesus didn't adhere to a particular flavor of contemporary politics in his day. Jesus thought about this differently and was here to actually usher in a more hopeful, whole, and true way of life. And I've personally benefited from the way that you two have lived that, and we're grateful in advance for the ways that you're going to share that with us tonight. And so, Tess, let's start with you. I'm really interested in some of your own faith journey, and we've been behind the scenes of this webinar. I've been using words like personal relationship with Jesus, and just kind of growing up in the milieu of American Christianity. Can you talk to us a little bit about your faith journey and some of the theology that was given to you and how it shaped the way that you saw God, yourself, and others?
Yeah, man, I've been thinking about this because I feel like I could talk forever about it. But when I kind of sum up my faith experience growing up, I was born into a family who was attending church on Sundays, and my mom was working in the nursery, and I would say we were at church every time the doors were open in a lot of ways. But really my experience, and at least what I was interpreting as a child, adolescent, teenager, was that knowing Jesus was about getting out of hell. It was an escape from an eternal fire. And so I grew up with a lot of fear about Jesus. I grew up with a lot in kind of fear that would be considered a dispensationalist around Israel and war. And I was always worried about that. I remember my mom talking about some peace treaty being signed and a prophecy with like a red moon. I don't know, but as a little kid, you're pulling on tidbits of all of this. And my kind of takeaway as a firstborn people pleaser rule follower was I have to do all of these things for Jesus to love me in order to spend eternity with him. And so as in my recollection, I don't remember learning about when Jesus prays, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That on earth as it is in heaven piece, that never like dawned on me till I was in my 20s. Like, what does he mean when he says that? Because everything that was coming at me growing up was really about leaving earth and getting to heaven. It was never about bringing heaven to earth here and now. It was never about Jesus like and his people like coming in and bringing life to those around us, to broken places, to marginalized places. And really probably politically, my family in the Bend and where I was we don't have time for that stuff. Like our permanent residence is in heaven. So that's what we're going to focus on. We're going to focus on checking our boxes and doing the things that we think will get us there. And we're going to vote for conservative leaders because we believe that, those certain issues are important. And it's just kind of again, it felt like even voting might've been a check in a box. I actually remember being in college, and it was the first time I was old enough to vote. And I started thinking like, wait, I'm just going to go vote straight one party down the ticket. That's what I've been taught my entire life. That's where the conversations have revolved. And I thought, do I even believe any of this stuff? And I actually didn't vote. And I kind of look back and I'm really sad that I didn't, but I had like a crisis of like, maybe in some ways I felt like morality of, I was just questioning everything. And I felt really guilty for doing that because again, what had been handed down to me was like, these are the truths. We don't question, we don't explore. You're here to obey God's law. And then if you do, and you'll get to spend eternity with him. Mm-hmm. And that's really kind of how I saw it for a really long time.
Yeah. So I hear words like rigid and fear and guilty, and I felt ashamed. And, there even seems like it seems like the world was small and, things like this for you. Help us understand if that's the theology that you were given. And I really resonate with that because that feels very similar to the theological upbringing that I had. Well, how did that flesh out in the way that you understood who God was and whom God was for and against? How did that shape how you viewed yourself, and how did that shape how you saw others around you?
Well, definitely in who God was for those people checking those boxes. And so when I went to a small private school too, so I didn't have a lot of opportunities to interact with people who weren't thinking that way, because the church that I went to also ran the school that I went to. And so I was really having, I felt like, a very singular experience. And so God wasn't for anyone who wasn't believing those things. Like, even, certain shows you weren't allowed to watch because those kids were, bad, or it would be a negative influence. And, in some ways you're thankful for some of those things, some of those protections. But I would say I was definitely a very sheltered person. And so I had no radar really for people who were different than me. It was almost as if, like, I didn't see them at all, because I was so focused on, these are the kinds of people I can hang out with. This is the kind of thing that's right. This is the kind of thing I'm going to pursue. And so if anybody seemed to fall outside of those lines, it was as if they were ignored by me in a lot of ways. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, oftentimes we talk about how that fear, causes us to actually isolate ourselves from people, because we're afraid that if we get too close to them, they'll somehow contaminate something. Yeah. Does that resonate at all with you? And if so, like, what is it that we were afraid that it would contaminate? And I also wonder, can you talk about what's the beauty in that? Is there anything has it grown anything in you of value that you still lean on to this day?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think definitely when that fear piece was, I remember being a freshman in college, and because I grew up in a private Christian school, I didn't have a lot of opportunities to go to a party. And we show up at this party, and I think they were playing some music that I found offensive, and I was like, I have to leave right now, And I was I was so offended all the time too, I feel like, by anything that didn't feel right to me, that maybe I would have put in the category of sin. And all the while, I'm literally missing out, I feel like, on life, like on the life that's in front of me, on the people that's in front of me, because of the judgment. I felt like God was judging me, right? He was a moral policeman in the sky, is who he was. I didn't really see God as loving. I saw him as angry. And so I felt like I took on those characteristics of God in my interactions with anyone that I felt like was not doing the things that God would want them to do. And so I would say I don't know that there's much I've leaned on since then, except for the complete rejection of it now that I've actually entered into the margins with people, and I've lived my life like in proximity with people in pain, with different upbringings, who look different than me and would think different than me, or would see something, like would worship different than me, whatever that looks like. I feel like that the judgment is what as I've gotten into adulthood, I've had to like continually keep breaking off. And in some ways you think it did, there was some holiness of God, and there was some healthy fear of God and wanting to like please him and for him, and the righteousness piece of it. But the motivator for me was fear. And that definitely kept me from engaging in the life.
Yeah, totally. So help us understand this. So it sounds like for you, your particular faith formation was a bit of a more rigid conservative faith formation. It's where my empathy just grew is understanding that, for you understood that God was angry all the time. And so therefore, it sounds like your life pursuit was to make sure that you were always seducing God's attention and affection so that God would like you better. Is that, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that's in some ways what I'm hearing. It grows my empathy.
Yeah.
What is there's a moment, you alluded to that voting moment when you're in college, that there was like an epiphany. Something happened. There was some sort of event that happened that began to move you in a direction of discovery, so that maybe you understood that your sight wasn't at 2020. So what happened, and then what was the journey that you took from that point forward?
Yeah. So that was kind of one of those like really significant moments for me where I just started to question things. And I remember I was at the football stadium where we were lining up to vote. There are, thousands of people there, all at my university. And it was like I almost became paralyzed of going, wait a minute. It was like I realized that I had a decision. Like I could make a choice. And then I was like, and I wasn't informed on that choice. And I almost felt like, well, again, the good girl, the moral girl in me, well, I can't go and like vote the way that I've been told to vote because I didn't do any research. I didn't learn anything about the candidates. Like, how can I get in line my very first time to be able to do this? And with honesty, put any checks in those boxes. And so I feel like I never questioned things. I mean, I look back growing up, there were like 2 or 3 times I asked some pretty significant questions as a kid and was shut down pretty harshly. And that wasn't a welcome thing. I still don't feel like I can really have conversations with my parents about things we may not see eye to eye with. I love them so much, but there's just that part of our relationship that I feel like is at a. And I think because they're living in some fear still, right? So they don't want to have to go there or think about those things. But so yeah, I'm 18 years old. This happens. And then as kind of my worldview started to expand, I just started taking classes and learning about different things. I took a class on, it was like global poverty. And we ended up going to Mexico for a week and living with families who were on different farms and working on the farm and learning about their lives. And like, I would pick avocados and like milk cows and drink it and just experiencing it really, it was my experiences that with people who weren't like me that started to change me and started to move me towards asking those really hard questions. And there was a deconstruction of my faith that I feel like it's still being worked out and still being in some ways reconstructed because I feel like I was handed down this interpretation of the Bible that was given to me by privileged people. And as I've started to get to know Jesus more and see him more and read the Gospels and look at his life and read prophecies, I'm going, man, Jesus was always making the oppressed the center of his stories. Like, this is like, he came to liberate people and he has asked me to partner with him in that. And so it's like, it's a whole new world opened up to me. And that was really because of those relationships. Because I couldn't now go, oh, what I considered blessing. A friend of mine said this the other day. She goes, now I just think it might have been white privilege. Like I'm thinking this is God's favor, but it was really just the privileges I had grown up with. And I feel like I started to go, what I considered blessing, and my church was a little health and wealth too. Well, if you were doing these things, God was going to bless you. And those blessings always were tied to something monetary too. And then I'm spending time with people who I'm going, they have a genuine relationship with Jesus and they don't have any of the things that I think you're supposed to have that symbolize, right, that God loves you and he's given you his favor. And so even that word blessing, I started seeing so differently. And that was through proximity. It was through proximity with people in the margins, people who'd been oppressed. And I look back on that journey over the last 15 years and go, man, those were God moments, right? He was putting those people in my life and I had no idea what was really happening, but,
got it. Yeah. I think it's phenomenal because someone who is given a rigid theology, a rigid faith experience, you get to a place where suddenly you give yourself permission to ask questions. You choose immersion or to intentionally displace yourself. You began to rediscover Jesus, who, as you said, oriented his life around the oppressed. And then you started to get into relationship with privilege. I offer those 4 bits because I'm hearing you get very practical in the decisions that you had to make, which were actually a rebellion to what faithfulness kind of looked like, right? Because you don't get near people who aren't like you. You talk about the Jesus that's been given to you. You don't ask questions, and you remain blind to privilege because the system benefits you as it is to some degree, right? So you had to rebel against who or what encouraged you to keep rebelling against what was faithfulness to this new way.
Yeah. And that's a great question. I remember being in church. I was going to a church called the Village Church at the time, and Matt Chandler was a new young pastor kind of on the rise, and was saying lots of things that were not so subversive, right? And I remember sitting there and him talking about this this kind of idea of like, you can ask God questions. Like, I remember this this very significant moment when he was talking about how Moses like wrestled with God, right? And was questioning God and got angry with God and like told God, I don't trust you. I don't believe you, or whatever it was, whatever he was feeling like he could go there with God, because you're not hiding anything from him anyway. He like knows you and your heart and your intentions. But it was like, I felt safe. Like, oh, this is a safe relationship. I can go and not only can I start to ask questions about my theology and faith, but I can ask those to God, and I can ask those to the people in my community group. I definitely had a group of girls that I was walking with that like had different stories than me, had different faith journeys, were seeing God differently. And I felt like every time we met, every Tuesday night, I'm getting these like little nuggets of wisdom that are completely transforming the way that I'm seeing the world, and how God's interacting with it and where he is at in it. And that's kind of when that idea of like, my kingdom come, my will be done on earth that is in heaven, I started going, what does that mean? What does God mean on earth that is in heaven? Like, and just kind of started to just start, reading.
Yeah.
Podcasts weren't as popular back then, I guess, or maybe they weren't even around. That was a long time ago.
Yeah.
But
Let me ask this final question, because I could imagine that people are sitting here listening in going, well, like, is the whole objective to go from a more rigid to a more like loosey-goosey, blurry, mysterious? Is it to go, and when Jenny, when we're chatting with you, is the goal to go from like liberal to conservative, or conservative to liberal? And that's not the conversation. That's probably not the objective here in the least. It's to actually grow more pro-human. And there's a theological orientation and a way that we interact politically that help move us in a way that's more pro-human, that contributes to the flourishing of all humanity, understanding that I think from a Christian perspective, folk flourish when they're reconciled to God through the blood of Jesus. So it's not let's move from one to the other, but Tess, you're doing work with people who are on a journey from a more rigid to a more spacious, or a more spacious to maybe more centered, or maybe more rigid in the work that you're doing. How did your experience of being handed a rigid theology and then awakening to wonder, how does it equip you to walk with people who are on a similar journey right now? Because there's a lot of us who are wondering, how do we do that work? How do we accompany people along the way?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of it, it has been learning to ask those questions. It has been when my husband and I had a couple over for dinner a couple of months ago, and they were new to the area, new to our church, an older couple in their 60s. And they're like, okay, what is this that you guys do with refugees? I mean, tell us about it, and immigrants. And they kind of walked into our home with that mindset of the boat's too full, we can't take any more people, and the people that are trying to come are MS-13, or, they had this one narrative. And as we got to sit down and talk and share kind of our experiences with immigrants that we know and refugees that we know, and what we know, particularly learning from Matt and Jenny and the books that they've written about the contributions that immigrants make to our society, and just telling like this refugee story of one of the boys, one of the first people that we met, that we got to invite into our lives, and like what his story was like, and him being orphaned in Congo at 8 and escaping in the back of a fish truck and living on the streets. I mean, and at the end of the conversation, they go, why doesn't anyone ever tell us this? I mean, and I feel like they walked into our home with one idea around immigration and around refugee resettlement, and they left with a completely different one because we got to tell the human story. And so I feel like as I've been getting to journey with people, as people have kind of come and asked questions, and I get to lead a group of women every Monday night, refugee teen girls and American women who've said, hey, we're going to enter into a relationship together, into a space where we're going to learn about how God made women and what it looks like to be women with potential and gifts and talents, and how we're going to be unleashed into the world. And as like different things come up, I feel like kind of wherever people are landing, right, we're trying to come back to that place where we're asking that question of what's broken around us, how do we immerse in it, and how do we bring heaven here? And it's not about entering in as the hero, right? It's about entering in as the learner, as a participant in the story that God's writing. And if I have 2 more minutes, Jason and I, my husband and our kids, we were in Jordan 2 summers ago, and still I'm on this journey. I still like want to come in and rescue, right? I still want to see myself as like the hero in the story. When I'm with people who for them, and so we're in Jordan, and I'm like, we're going to go and meet refugees and work in refugee camp. And I'm really excited. Like, how's God going to use me, right? Because he just, I was so needed there is my mentality. And we end up meeting this couple named Ghazwan and Huda. They invite us over for iftar. It was during Ramadan that we were there, and we break fast and we spend all night together, and they invite us over another night and another night. And as we're becoming friends, I'm really enjoying getting to know them, but I'm still feeling like I'm not meeting anyone's needs. So God, why did you bring me here? And it was a really hard summer to have our kids in Jordan during Ramadan. I have no community. My husband's gone during the day, like studying Arabic. And so I was praying one night, and I was like, I was pretty mad at God. Like, why am I here? Why did you bring me all the way here? This has just been miserable. There's no purpose in it. And I just remember like so clearly feeling like the Lord said, I brought you here for Ghazwan and Huda. Like, I love them. And it was like this moment of clarity for me where I saw like in them and like their full humanity, and in the ways God was seeing them, the same ways he's seeing me, right? I had myself kind of elevated in this place and going, oh my gosh, he loves them so much that my family came here. And again, not to rescue, but to be with them, to contend for them, to immerse in their story. We did get to sponsor them. They live 10 minutes down the road from us now, and we have a really robust relationship with them. And like, we're friends, right? The relationship's totally transcended all of my experiences or what I could have ever thought, like why I was in Jordan that summer. But it was one of those moments where I was like, man, He is here and now, and he is bringing the kingdom to earth, and I can join him, or I can make all of this about me.
Yeah. Tess, thanks for taking 2 more minutes to tell that story. That's the stuff. I'm writing down copious notes. I don't know, for those of you who are listening in, how you're listening to this. I'm listening to this in terms of myself as a practitioner who's on a journey, and I want to see more clearly. And ours is a Jesus who was a sight healer and is a sight healer. And so I'm on a journey, but I'm also recognizing I have spheres of influence, and there are people in my spheres of influence who are asking a lot of questions, or are making big, huge statements, and I'm finding myself struggling to accompany them well. And I just heard 5 things from Tess that can help me actually accompany them well, most notably expose them to the human stories. And I also heard her say, accept invitations. Are we placing ourselves in relationships with people where we are being offered invitations to share tables to then begin to build the relationships where we begin to see God's at work in my life and in these people's lives too. So those are two really practical ways that we can be accompanying people along the way. And so thanks, Tess. We'll come back in a little bit. Jenny, we want to come to you. The faith and politics. I mean, it's an unbelievable conversation around, are we Christians? Are we citizens? Was Jesus political? Wasn't he? Should we get involved? But all of us kind of are. How do we think about all this? I mean, this is the soup that we're swimming in today's world. And you are in the epicenter of it in so many ways, both personally, but also vocationally in the work that you're doing. And so talk to us a little bit about your experience of your own politic being shaped, and then over time, how your politic and theology, as I heard you say earlier, how did your political involvement begin to shape a theology, and how are these things becoming fused?
Yeah, well, I think that the whole topic of this webinar is so interesting, because when you actually look at the church in a global context, I think the United States is a unique context in how we marry our political ideology with our theology. I mean, when you talk about churches in Asia and Africa, this isn't, it's an issue, I think, in certain cases, but I think in the United States, it has become almost a hyper partisanship that I think has affected the church, and it's affecting our discipleship, I think, as followers of Jesus, and really being a good witness and a faithful witness. And it's interesting to hear Tess's story, because even as she grew up understanding kind of the role of politics and how it was almost given to her, I grew up in a community where I did not think about politics at all. I mean, I grew up in a conservative Korean Presbyterian church in Northwest Philadelphia. I was born and raised in Philly. My parents still live there. And growing up in a small Korean church, it was always about, personal relationship with Jesus and being missional in how I live my life. But, the church never talked about politics. We didn't know, I wasn't fully aware of the impact of politics and political systems on my community. And other than my dad kind of knowing, he would vote all the time. And he would tell me, I just want to vote. But other than that, I never really understood the intersect of politics with my faith. And it wasn't really until I started actually working at World Relief in service to refugees that I really came to see how systems and structures and policies impact and should be influenced by our Christian faith. And part of it was I never had an interest in politics. In fact, I thought it wasn't and shouldn't be a part of our Christian agenda or part of our Christian witness. But I realized to a certain degree that if we're completely disconnected from politics, I don't think we can truly love our neighbor. And the reason I say that is because the whole idea of being political means engaging the systems and structures in which our neighbors live. And if we're really seeking the shalom of our neighbors, we oftentimes have to talk about and get political and talk about the systems and structures that will allow our neighbors to fully thrive. And I think when I first started out working at World Relief in the public policy area, I realized that what was so alarming is that the Christian community, the church, was the one that was the most vocally anti-immigrant. It was the one that was most vocally anti-refugee. And that narrative really impacted me, because I knew that narrative that the church was leading in that was so anti-immigrant was actually leading to specific policies by our elected officials that was impacting the people that I had come to know. I mean, the immigrant communities I knew growing up, the refugees that I had come to know in Baltimore City. And so I think so much of our Christian witness today has swung away from not being political, that it's hard to find the middle ground to really understand, well, how do I not be hyper partisan and be so rigid in my allegiance to one political party, but also not be completely apolitical where I ignore systems and structural issues that actually can impact my neighbors, my vulnerable neighbors who actually need changes in laws in order for them to fully thrive. And so I think the hard part for me has been finding that middle ground of really trying to understand, what does it mean to be a faithful Christian witness in a time when being hyper partisan is kind of the norm. and it's there's been some polling that's been done recently where 50 years ago they asked, what is the one thing you don't want your son or your daughter to marry into that's different from your own family? And they said, well, I don't want my son or daughter to marry someone from a different race. So that was like 50 years ago. But now when you ask the same question, parents don't want their children to marry someone of a different political party. So it's not the racial issue, it's the political party preference that I think affects our view of our neighbors and even our own family. And so I think right now the challenge for us as Christians is, how do we see our politics as a way to be faithful public witnesses at a time when we can edge on partisanship? And I think a lot of times we've confused partisanship with politics and said, well, I don't want to be political, when in actuality, we don't want to be partisan, right? We don't want to be wed to one political party. But I do think we should be political. I think we should engage in politics in a way that brings change to dominant narratives that can be really negative about people made in the image of God. And I also think that we need to engage in these conversations in a way that really brings to light the ways that our elected officials have failed to recognize the image of God in a lot of our vulnerable neighbors as well. And so, yeah, it's been a challenge, but I think in the communities that I've been in and in the churches that I've been to, that this is a challenge that a lot of us face, is trying to have political conversations in a way that doesn't alienate others. And I will just say this, that like two things that I think learned just in having these conversations. So I went to a rural area of Ohio one time, and I drove 2 hours and away from like Cleveland. And as I was driving there, I entered into Amish country. And literally as I was driving there, I saw, Amish schoolhouses and horse and buggies, and I had to like drive around them. And I entered into this church, and the first thing that the person who asked me to go there was, what he said to me was, you should know two things. First is everyone here voted for Trump. So this is like Trump country. And the second thing you should know is everyone here watches Fox News. I was like, that's great. Like, that's the kind of audience that I would love to talk to. And after I gave like a 40-minute talk about refugees, and this woman and I talked at the end, and she started telling me, well, I kind of understand your perspective, but I just don't think we should be accepting Muslim refugees. They're totally different than us. They believe in Sharia law. And she basically started like spouting all the talking points that I'd come to know from, certain elected officials or from certain news sources. But what she told me kind of towards the middle of the conversation was that she also is a woman who fostered, 6 kids that had drug addictions, and she knew the cost of doing that. Her church family disowned her, and she, she paid a price for the fact that she was fostering these kids. She said to me, well, I can see where you're coming from, because it seems like in the work that you're doing that there is almost a cost to doing the things that Jesus wants us to do. And as I was talking with her, I felt like scales were falling off of her eyes, where she was starting to see Muslim refugees as not the enemy, but as people whom God has called us to serve and to love. And in that conversation, it made me realize, she concluded by saying, well, I watch Sean Hannity every night. I think he's the kindest man on earth. And he's like, I'm going to write him an email and ask him to have you on your show, because I just think that he would benefit from hearing your perspective. And so in that conversation, I think there's a couple of things I realized. First is that, oftentimes when people don't have the same experiences or relationships, and they're being fed a lot of misinformation, there's every reason why they should be fearful. I mean, if I was in her position, I would be fearful too. And so from that conversation, I realized that, she's not motivated by racial prejudice. I think a lot of it is just lack of relationship. And, like traditionally, if I were to talk to her and have my defenses up, I would probably assume that she was, racist or what have you, because of of the way that she was thinking. But I just realized she just wasn't exposed to correct information or even to relationships to change her point of view. And the second thing I realized is that there's a lot of people who are following Jesus at a cost. And sometimes they haven't learned to apply their faith in the whole realm of relationships and issues to which God calls us to engage with. And I think it really opened my eyes to see that engaging in these conversations and not questioning the motivations of why people think a certain way, it needs to be the beginning for us to engage in these conversations. And so that's just one story of a conversation I had, an experience I had that really helped me to have these really tough political conversations. And yeah, it was just one of many of examples of tough conversations I've had.
Totally. Yeah. I'm grateful for the story. I'm going to get hyper practical with you for a second here, Jenny, because I've seen you, like none of us are apolitical. You know, there are things that, you know, my theology informs the way I view the world. And I think that systems should reflect a certain, you know, in a certain way. And so like, I can't say I'm not political and you can't say you're not political. And I have strong convictions about something, and so do you. I've seen you interact with people who have a very different theological and political perspective in a way that is gracious and centered and patient and contained. You smile gently. You're not pretentious. You don't seem defensive. You don't seem like you have any need to convert them in any way. Talk to us about, in this moment when you're in conversation with something like that, talk to us about what's happening inside of your body, what's happening inside of your heart and soul and mind, and how have you trained to be able to stand and hold space in those encounters in a way that actually emanates grace and generosity and spaciousness?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of times me entering these conversations is really about me seeing them as children of God, as sons and daughters of God, and of them maybe not just having, I mean, even for me, even though I'm Korean American and I'm a minority, I still think of myself as being the beneficiary of significant privilege. I mean, even though my parents immigrated here, you know, I'm educated, I went to college, and my parents sacrificed a lot for me to have certain experiences. And so you know, what Tess was saying earlier about privilege, it's how do we use our privilege in a way where we can walk alongside those who are on a same journey. And so I think a lot of times when I have difficult conversations, I always try to understand why people are saying the things that they're doing and not, again, question their motivations or why they're saying it. I think a lot of times people have a lot of fear about things that they don't understand or they don't know. I also think that they don't have the relationships that will help them transform their understanding. And a lot of times it's because people have never, you know, traveled overseas, or, you know, they don't live in a community that's really diverse. And so their lack of and limit of relationships has led them to think a certain way. And so it's not because they're malintentioned or because they don't take their faith seriously and love Jesus as to why they think a certain way. I think a lot of times it's because of, again, a lack of experiences and maybe even a certain ignorance, perhaps, that puts them in a certain position to think a certain way. And so, you know, I think the commonality that we all have is that we love Jesus and we're trying to be faithful to his scriptures. I think whenever there's an opportunity to talk about the ways of Jesus and the teachings of Jesus, and to bridge that commonality and to build that into conversation, I think that's the best way to go, because I'm not going to convince someone with statistics and data. But what I will convince somebody about is the human story and the human narrative, and how someone whom you can consider your enemy is struggling to provide the same things for their lives or their families' lives as the same as you are. And so there's always more commonality, I think, than what differentiates us. And I think that about anyone that I'm having a conversation with, even though they fundamentally disagree with me. And so I think being faithful to have those tough conversations in a way that brings commonality out of that, I think is really critical. But I also think just having that common theology is always helpful as well.
Absolutely. So there's a Q&A feature. We've got about 7 minutes left here in this particular conversation. There's all sorts of ideas that are going on in terms of future conversations that need to be had, like which Jesus? I'm running into all sorts of different flavors of Jesus that shape a particular kind of politic, that inform how I care about particular things. Which Jesus are we following, and how do we audit our Jesus and things like that? That might be a future conversation and something that you're wondering about. as well. So if there's anything that's coming up for you in terms of curiosity, throw a question into the Q&A feature. We'd love to interact with it here. But while you're thinking about that, let me just offer one more question. For both of you, I'm hearing the need for a lot more time than we actually have. Like if I'm going to seek commonality, if I'm going to see the image of God in someone, if I'm going to understand somebody's motivations, it's going to take an incredible amount of time. How do we do this? How do we become the kinds of people who see people this way, recognizing that time is incredibly limited? What have you guys found to be helpful in your own formation?
I know for me, I think acknowledging and continually trying to acknowledge my own brokenness, my own short-sightedness, my own blindness. And so that when I encounter someone who I feel like we're just missing each other, we're not seeing one another. I mean, there are people who I've gone, I can't move towards this person and acknowledge their mutual humanity and dignity. I am so angry right now. Over the weekend, not on purpose, got into a 176 comment Facebook discussion, Facebook is not a good place for dialogue, but it happened. And I just found myself at times like placing that judgment on people and really ignoring kind of their humanity or where they might be coming from. And so I feel like for me, it's just that conscious decision to go back and acknowledge my own brokenness and try to move towards people in that, like assuming the best. That is something that I have found is so helpful for me. This on there that were extremely harmful and hurtful. Someone said to another person, they posted a picture of an aborted baby and said, "This baby's blood is on your hands." I mean, this is where this thing went. And I felt like I had two choices in that moment, is how I was going to engage. And I know the person who posted that image, and I said, I'm going to enter into this, and I wrote this, and I am going to assume the best about you. I don't think that you're for babies being separated at the border, because the conclusion they were drawing was that if we voted for a particular politician, then we were voting for abortion, and that we somehow, I guess, wanted babies to be aborted was kind of the line of logic. I said, you voted for Trump. They made that obvious. And I genuinely don't think that you are pro families being ripped apart at the border and children in cages. I was just at the border 2 weeks ago with the National Immigration Forum. I saw it with my own eyes. There are literally children in cages. And I really don't think you're for that. And I'm going to assume that about you. And now we have a jumping place to have a conversation. Because if we're just labeling one another and we're missing that like human element and going, man, this person may feel so fearful. Their lived experience is informing them of something different than mine is. But can we find that middle ground, like you were saying, Jenny?
I think she froze on us here for a second. Jenny, while we're waiting for her to come back, how would you interact with that question?
Yeah, I think just we're so used to labels and categories, and it helps us organize our lives, and we can label and categorize others, especially with whom we disagree. But I think, again, going beyond categories and labels of individuals to really understand our common kind of humanity. I mean, it sounds so generic, but I think there's always something we can learn from somebody else. And there's always something in which we can learn about how to live our lives faithfully in ways that maybe we ourselves are not doing. And I think if we have that mark of humility as far as of Jesus, we should always be learners, right? We should always be learning from other folks who maybe are living in ways that they've been more faithful in other areas than maybe I haven't been. And so I think it's similar to what Tess was saying about acknowledging our own fallenness and our own brokenness, that we don't do this work or we don't engage in tough conversations because we have all the right answers, but we do it because we ourselves recognize that we need to be more faithful, and that there is something we can learn from everybody. And so, you know, even your crazy uncle at Thanksgiving dinner, I know it's in a few months, you know, even from him, you can learn a life, you know, why does he think that way? Are there certain experiences that he's had that makes him think a certain way? And is there an opportunity in that to shift the narrative where you can bring a human element to the story in which they can relate to that? And so part of that is, again, I think it's the theological part, but it's bringing relationships and the humanness of other stories into this conversation that I think can be really transformative.
Absolutely. Thank you two so much for your input. For those of you who are listening in, and again, thinking about how do I become the kind of person that sees the humanity and dignity and image of God in people. We just heard an hour's worth of content that was hyper practical. I want to play back something really quickly, and then we'll close us down. I just heard you two say, I need to acknowledge my limitations. I need to assume the best. I need to refuse labels and premature conclusions. I need to always choose curiosity. These are not easy things. These are not easy commitments to make, which raises for me the issue of community and what does it mean to shape communities around these kinds of commitments? Because that seems a lot like Jesus to me. It seems a lot like the way that Jesus engaged people, assumption-free, assuming the best, longing for their flourishing. What is the lived liturgy that we can create in communities within our spheres of influence to become these kinds of people, so that we're moving toward relationship rather than being right? So Jenny and Tess, thank you so much for even just this brief conversation. I feel like it blitzed by, and I feel like there's hours and hours more. But hyper practical nuggets emerged for us in terms of how we can become these kinds of people. So friends, for those of you who are listening in, thanks for joining in. A couple things coming up we want to draw your attention to. First of all, there's going to be an email coming out after this webinar, probably within the next 24 hours. That will include a recording of this webinar, along with a practical guide to accompany you into a way of life. And so our team has been listening into this conversation, harvesting the practical nuggets, and we're going to create some conversation and some experiments for you to begin to grow some muscle around this way of life. And so be watching for that. You'll get the recording and a PDF, which will be a practical guide. We're also going to expose you more to Jenny and Tess so that you can be in touch with them and the work that they're doing. I actually happen to have Jenny's latest project here in front of me. I'm using this with a huge delegation here in Central Oregon, welcoming the strangers, which is I think the perennial resource as we're talking about politics, immigration, and faith. And so we'll have all of those links in the email for you to get connected with that work. Wanted you to know that this webinar series is a monthly installation of Global Immersion, that it's free, and it's made possible by the generosity of our Embers community, which are a collective of individuals who invest in the everyday peacemaking movement in a monthly way to make sure that resources and conversations like these get into us as accessibly as possible. And so a huge thank you to our funders who make these types of conversations and resources possible. The last thing we want to draw your attention to and you'll see this in the email, is that Global Immersion is hosting a retreat. It's the first of its kind. It's a global gathering that's designed to link the everyday peacemaking movement together. It's going to happen in September of 2019. It's going to happen in Tijuana. It's going to involve all sorts of unbelievable women and men who are doing some of the most important restorative work on the planet. And we're going to convene together. We're going to connect. We're going to pursue some restoration together. And we're going to accelerate this movement forward. And you're invited. We want you to be there. And so you're going to see a link to the retreat in that email, and it's going to give you some action items to take to get some more information on that. So friends, I'll close with this. One of my favorite stories is when Jesus is moving into Jericho with his entourage, and there's a blind dude named Bartimaeus sitting outside the gates. And he starts screaming like crazy because he's the blind guy, but he's the only one that's crystal clear on who Jesus is. And everybody wants Jesus to ignore the blind person. But Jesus pays careful attention to the blind person. That in and of itself is really significant for us in this conversation. While everyone else is saying, they're blind, don't pay attention to them, Jesus is saying, no. there's something about this encounter. So then Jesus walks up to him and walks up to the blind guy and says, what do you want me to do for you? And I'm not sure if you're in proximity with blind folk, but oftentimes physically you can tell that blind folk are blind. And so it's odd that Jesus, who can see, is asking the blind guy, what do you want me to do for you? And Bartimaeus says, I want to see. And his desire, his declaration, his acknowledgement of his own limitation did something in Jesus. And Jesus said, your faith has healed you. Receive sight. And so, friends, this conversation, yes, is about how do we accompany people along a way, but more than that, this is a conversation about how we, like blind Bartimaeus, need to declare with our lives to Jesus, I want to see, and he's faithful to answer that prayer. So go with that, friends. Thanks for being here tonight. We look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. Until then.